As a normal scientist, Doc Ock hated the Hardy Foundation because they didn't finance the great experiment that he wanted to work on. But when Doc Ock became the supervillain he is after that incredible accident, his hatred turned to a rage that is indescribable. And in order to get his revenge, he kidnapped Felicia Hardy, the daughter of the head of the Hardy Foundation. And to just add another bit of intrigue in the whole thing, he also kidnapped J. Jonah Jameson. So poor Spidey has to rescue both Felicia Hardy and J. Jonah Jameson from the now super powerful and furious, mad, raging Doc Ock. You're going to enjoy it. In the story, The Cat, I want to tell you, you've got to feel sorry for Felicia Hardy. She had just been kidnapped in the first story. Bingo, she's kidnapped again. So here you've got S.H.I.E.L.D., you've got Nick Fury, you've got the cat, you've got the cat's daughter, you've got Spider-Man, who has to save the day, of course, and you've got the Kingpin, and you've got Doc Ock. And if there's anyone else that could be crowded in a story, I don't know how you could do it. This one you're going to really love. And now the second part of that great story, The Black Cat. This one is great because you're going to be in at the birth of a new superhero, the Black Cat. What happens is she gets injected with her father's serum, and it turns her into, instead of just normal Felicia Hardy, it turns her into the Black Cat. She gets the powers that the serum was supposed to give American soldiers to make them super soldiers. Now she has that power. Well, while this is going on, the Kingpin had inadvertently introduced her to Spider-Man. She and Spidey team up, and they've got to find a way to rescue her father, the original cat, from the Kingpin and Doc Ock. So you can imagine the action, the danger, and the suspense in this one. You've heard of the labors of Hercules. Forget them. Wait till you see what poor Spider-Man has to do. The poor guy has to rescue the Black Cat from Alistair Smythe. And in order to do that, he's got to capture either the Vulture or the Scorpion in order for Smythe to get their DNA and use that to make Silvermane, the infantile Silvermane, more grown up and more powerful. And that's only part of the problem. I won't tell you what happens. You're going to have to watch this one. You've got to see a couple of the really old Spider-Man cartoons. They're not much on story, but there's a lot of action and fighting, as you'll see in the cartoon where Spidey goes up against Doc Ock. I mean, it's just a few minutes of our spider-powered superhero fighting the octopus-powered villain. It's old, it's a little bit corny, you're gonna like it. Here's one that'll knock you out of your chair. Spidey has to fight the cold-wielding aliens from Pluto, the Plutonians. And all it is, they're aliens from the planet Pluto who have the power of extreme cold. You're going to get a few minutes of Spidey single-handedly battling them. It's not the greatest exercise in intellectualism, but I want to tell you, you're going to talk about it for a long time to come. Enjoy it. You know, Doc Octopus, or Doc Ock, or Dr. Octopus, has always been one of my favorites for a number of reasons. One, I love nicknames. And by getting a guy called Octavius and then being able to nickname him Doc Octopus. See, he was a professor whose name was Otto Octavius, and when he taught his class, as students do, they gave him the nickname of Dr. Octopus instead of Octavius. Then I gave him the nickname, of course I gave him the student's nickname too, because I wrote the story. But after they nicknamed him Dr. Octopus, I called him Doc Ock, which is my own nickname of a nickname, and as I say, I love nicknames. In coming up with villains, you're always trying to create something that is a little bit original, that people haven't seen before. And as far as I know, there hadn't been a guy with 4 tentacles that could expand and retract and do all the things that Doc Ock's tentacles could do. So I felt that he was kind of an original character. Also, he wasn't really an ugly, monstrous, typical supervillain, but he was just an ordinary middle-aged professor, with a roundish face and glasses, and that I thought was sort of unique too. But don't let his innocent appearance fool you. You wouldn't want to be caught in a fight with Doc Ock. When I first created Doc Ock, I really didn't have much of a backstory to him. He was just a fellow. Now, as I remember, he worked on radioactive material, and he had these 2 artificial arms which they used to go through a shielded device, and he was on one side of the device, and in manipulating the radioactive material, he couldn't touch it himself, so he had to use these 2 artificial arms. What he was teaching, I don't know. I'm no scientist. Something to do with nuclear fission and radioactivity or something. I just said he was a scientist working on radioactive material. So that was about all the backstory that I had for him. My guess is that in the future, new writers at Marvel will at some time or other come up with all sorts of backstory for him that I hadn't thought of. That's the nice thing. I come up with some nice, simple, basic, and then guys who are far cleverer than I am, they give it all the dimension and the roundness and the background that I never bothered to think of. I try not to make all the villains I did purely 100% evil. Actually, Dr. Octavius, when he was Dr. Otto Octavius, he was a good guy. I mean, he taught science or whatever he taught, and he was all right. But of course, he had this accident in the lab that grafted the tentacles to him and affected his personality. So he became evil. But I'd like to think that beneath all the sinister qualities he has, there's still a normal, nice guy trying to get out. Luckily, for the sake of our stories and keeping them interesting, it hasn't gotten out yet. Originally, when I started writing Spider-Man, I always like to give characters weaknesses, because if they're too powerful or if they can do anything, the stories aren't as much fun. When Spider-Man shot his webbing, I built in the fact that it would only last so long, and after a while, let's say it was holding a villain captive, but after a while the webbing would fall off. It wouldn't stay there forever, so Spider-Man better do what he had to do quickly while the fellow was trussed up. But after I stopped writing the series, other writers came along and they sort of forgot that angle. And now it seems that the webbing will last just as long as the writer wants it to last in any story. There doesn't seem to be a rule for it anymore. The thing I love about Spider-Man's webbing is he can do anything with it that you can imagine, really. The most obvious thing, the thing I liked the most, was whenever he was falling from a great height, he could just shoot it up over his head and form it into a parachute that would break his fall, or at least slow it down. He can obviously shoot it ahead of him and capture somebody who's running away, trip the guy up. He uses it to swing from building to building or tree to tree or wherever he's going. He can use it if somebody is aiming a gun at him. I've had him shoot the webbing where it goes inside the gun barrel. And if the person were to fire, were to pull the trigger, he'd blow himself up. So almost anything you can think of. Sometimes, I remember years ago I did some stories where, as Peter Parker, he's sitting in a restaurant, let's say, eating, and he wants the sugar for his coffee. And the sugar is on the next table. And he can't get the waitress's eye. And if he makes sure that no one's looking, he'll zing a little webbing over, get the sugar, and spill it in, and nobody noticed him. So whatever I, as the writer, or any other writer can dream up, he can do with the webbing. It's sort of an all-purpose webbing. I think virtually everything has been done. We've had characters who are very strong, who are very fast, who can fly, who can swim underwater, who can walk through walls, who can teleport, who can shoot all sorts of beams out of their eyes or their fingertips. So there again, the only original way to do that is to think of a beam that somebody shoots out of his or her fingers or eyes that in some way is different than other beams. It becomes increasingly difficult to get very original villains, which is why I'm glad I did them years and years ago, because I had a lot more scope at the time that I was doing it. There weren't as many around. Of all the superheroes I've created, I've been asked, who has the character trait that I most admire? Well, I guess I would have to say the Silver Surfer, because the way I did him anyway in the beginning, he was the closest thing to somebody who is totally good, almost saint-like. And there's no way that I can put myself in that class, but he'd be the guy that I would admire the most for his character. Trying to think of somebody on the flip side of that, what character that I've created has some character trait that is the most questionable? Maybe Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, because at least while I was writing it, he didn't always want to be a hero. He was more like me. He used to say, why should I go out and risk my life with you guys doing all of that? I'd rather be driving my Corvette and going out on a date. Now, I don't say that's questionable. To me, that's very human and very normal. And that's the way I think I would have felt. If I were president for one day, I've been asked, what would be the first thing I'd do? Well, I'd try to get an amendment put through the Constitution so that I could be the president for longer than one day. There isn't much the president can do without the approval of Congress and so forth. So I don't know. As I say, I'd just be trying to stay a little longer so I could get stuff done. If time travel were possible, I think my first choice might be to go back to the time of Leonardo da Vinci. Because of all the people who've lived before and after, I always thought that he was probably the most certifiable genius. And I'd like to get to know him and find out what made him tick and where did he get the ideas in those days for an airplane and a submarine and all the things that he did and the ability to paint the way he did. And I've always been fascinated by Da Vinci. It's funny, there are so many things I've never done. I guess that goes for everybody. Nobody can do everything. One of the things that I've never done that I think I would really want to do is fly an airplane, myself, be the pilot. I love flying. My wife will not let me take flying lessons. She just said, come on. She said, there are other ways to spend your time. She's afraid of that. During World War II, I knew a girl who took me up she was a member of the Women's Civil Air Command or something, and she flew her own plane. And she took me up in a little Piper Cub, and I had 15 minutes flying time because she let me take the controller, just a joystick, for 15 minutes. She said, you can't do anything wrong. If you want to go to the left, you do this. If you want to go to the right, you do that, and that's it. So I flew around, and she gave me a log book where I have my official 15 minutes flying time. I think ever since then I've wanted to be a pilot.